Welcome to the Stop and Think series. I'm Will Markham. It's a series dedicated to training you on how to think because your only line of defense against propaganda is your ability to read between the lines. And today's lesson is on gaslighting. Gaslighting is a term that originated from a 1940s film called Gaslight. And the term represents a psychological strategy, a strategy that involves a series of tactics to undermine and destroy a person's sense of reality. In other words, to make the other person feel crazy. Now, why is gaslighting a thing these days? Well, because it's so effective. But then, why is it so effective? And the answer to that is because, you see, people don't live or think in their reality. For example, when people think of a chair, they automatically think of something to sit on. They automatically think of the functional uses of the object needed for survival, and not thinking what the object actually is, a wooden object with 4 legs and a base, and so forth. In other words, we don't see things for what they are, we see things for what they do for us. And this is essentially why gaslighting is so incredibly effective, because we as human beings, we manufacture our own reality in our minds, not based on what actually exists, but how we want to interpret it. And this interpretation revolves around a functional survival, the reality we create so that we can live our lives to the best of our abilities, and most often, this functional survival is in the social realm. And because the default setting of our minds revolves around social survival, this is when and how we as humans are easily programmed. For example,
the Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1.
1.
2.
1.
Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3.
3.
3.
3.
3.
The Ash experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again.
this is gaslighting. And as we can see from the experiment, we humans tend to value what is trendy over what is true because we are social creatures, manufacturing our own reality based on a social survival. So, do we see the world in the way it has been branded to us? Or do we see the world the way it actually is? But it gets even deeper. Yes, there's more. Because there are 2 ways of gaslighting. One way to program someone is by identifying how they create their reality, by figuring out their social needs, figuring out their values, figuring out what makes them tick, and then exploiting it. And then the other way is to destroy their sense of reality altogether and make them feel crazy. Both of these are gaslighting strategies. And gaslighting is not just a one-time thing. It's a ruthless process compounded over and over again, tactic after tactic after tactic. The goal is not just to sell a product like an astroturfing. The goal is to destroy their mind slowly but surely using very simple and subtle means. And every gaslighting tactic has one thing in common: to confuse. So let's get started with tactic number 1, the shock reaction or mock reaction. Now, the purpose of this faked reaction is to make the other person feel like they're weird or abnormal, extreme, or crazy when they're not crazy. They're just ordinary human beings who happen to disagree. A common example of this is from the 2016 election in the Democratic primaries. Now, if you were to say to a normal person, "I think I'll be voting for Vermin Supreme," an ordinary response would be, "The guy who wears a shoe on his head and promises free ponies? Yeah, he's pretty silly, but go for it. You can vote for anyone you want." But if I were to say to someone who uses this shock reaction gaslighting tactic and say, "I think I'll be voting for Bernie Sanders," it's, "How could you? Bernie is unelectable. How could you possibly vote for someone like that?" Or, "I think I'll be voting for Donald Trump." It's, "How could you? Trump is a monster. How could you possibly vote for someone like that?" And then there's the mock reaction, which I don't even need to describe because we all know what mocking sounds like. The purpose of these tactics is to, instead of engaging in the dialogue or debate, you just laugh at them and act like they're a lunatic. And the purpose of this is to confuse the other person. And now with tactic number 2, one of the more common ones, inflicting guilt. Now, the most important thing I can teach you about guilt is that it is used as a weapon. Yes, a weapon of emotional abuse for the purpose of control. The primary weapon of emotional abusers is the deliberate infliction of guilt. They use guilt in the same way a loan shark uses money. They don't want the debt paid off because they live quite happily on the interest. Inflicting guilt is all about trying to control people from the inside. And the reason this control tactic is so effective is because the victim has a hard time distinguishing between the guilt that should naturally be there from the inside versus the toxic guilt imposed from others. So how does one determine between the natural guilt on the inside versus toxic guilt? The short answer to this very complex subject is natural guilt is felt when you realized you harmed someone else because of something you did or said or should have done or said. Everything else that's not in this category ranges from unhelpful to flat out toxic. And for the most part, this everything else represents the residual effects of all the people in your life trying to control you from one direction or another direction. In other words, this means that someone who suffers from toxic guilt has most likely been pulled and controlled for a good chunk of their early life. And this is exactly what the gaslighter is all about, pulling you and controlling you through guilt. Now, for examples of this toxic guilt, or guilt tactic, we have voter shaming and voter blaming. Now, it's low enough to trash the candidates and go into a smear campaign, but it takes a special kind of bullying to shame people when they don't vote the way you want them to vote. The prominent narratives pushed during the 2016 election from corporate public relations forces were, number one, if you don't vote how the corporate oligarchy wants you to vote, you are labeled selfish. If you don't vote the way the corporate oligarchy wants you to vote, you are labeled racist or sexist. Number three, if you don't vote how the corporate oligarchy wants you to vote, you are labeled privileged. And then we all remember this one, a vote for Jill Stein is a vote for Trump. And as we learned from the Solomon Asch experiment on social conformity, all the oligarchy needs to do is manufacture their own trends. Because once those trends are created, what naturally happens is that the people who follow the trends will shame and guilt those who choose not to follow the trends. And now for tactic number 3, applying a negative connotation. This tactic is one that works at the subconscious level. All you have to do is that whenever you speak about a person or a country or a group of people, you alter your tone of voice to make it sound like that person or group is to be feared or cautioned. It signals to the subconscious mind that these people are scary. For example, you'll notice that whenever the news is talking about a brutal leader that we have no interest in going to war with, such as Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Angola, or Sudan, they'll talk about these regimes as quite ordinary countries as if there's nothing wrong. But when the topic comes up about Iran or North Korea or Vladimir Putin or Assad, the tone becomes different, like a subtle watch out. And they'll apply this negative connotation and build it up month after month, year after year, just like we saw with Saddam and his weapons of mass destruction for many months. The negative connotation is but one part of a process called the rhetoric of regime change. For example,
Mr. President, you know the rhetoric of regime change is headed towards you from the United States. They are actively looking for a new Syrian leader. They're granting visas and visits to Syrian opposition politicians. They're talking about isolating you diplomatically and perhaps a coup d'etat or your regime crumbling. What are you thinking about that?
I feel very confident.
And this negative connotation isn't just used for other countries. It is also used to instill fear upon certain individuals, such as with Donald Trump, or upon groups of people, such as the terrorists, or even upon political terms that the oligarchy wants to paint as the enemy, such as socialist or nationalist, or even upon terms like populist.
In one of the most hotly contested presidential races the country has ever seen. As France goes to the polls, we ask, are we looking at another populist revolt? Do you know what the definition of populism is, Tim? Supporting the concerns of ordinary people. When did populism become a dirty word? When people vote the way we want them to, it's democracy. When they don't, it's populism, extremism. You know.
So this is something to watch out for. Every time they apply a negative connotation to anything, ask yourself why. Why are they trying to say this in a negative light? Why do they want us to be afraid of this group or people? Why does Fox News want us to be afraid of immigrants? Because more often than not, the reason is either 1, to sell you a war, or 2, to divide and conquer, making sure that Americans are fighting each other instead of the corrupt leaders. And now for tactic number 4, false authority. What this tactic is all about is that instead of using evidence as authority, it uses authority as evidence. And here's an example.
If we had known the intelligence was wrong, we would not have gone into Iraq. But the intelligence community, all 16 agencies, assured us that it was right. My speech at the UN was based on that information.
Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
So whenever you see this tactic, you can be rest assured that they do not have the evidence they speak of. Yet there's more to it, because think for a moment. Why would they act so confident and double down on it all when they don't have the evidence? And the answer as to why they would double down with no evidence is because they're trying to gaslight you into believing something. And the reason this tactic is so successful is because people think to themselves, well, these people are experts and they should know, so maybe I'm the crazy one. Or they can't possibly be all wrong, so maybe I'm the one who's wrong. The media will also use, as a much more subtle false authority tactic, where they will host an expert on a particular subject matter, but in reality they're just a corporate shill or a political shill with a fully biased message. This tactic is so common that you'll encounter it on an hourly basis. And so the trick is to not trust an authority, but instead trust in evidence, and never trust any authority that doesn't provide evidence. And now moving on to tactic number 5, poisoning the well. This tactic is where a person preemptively labels someone as a way to automatically dismiss what they might say in the future. For example,
I don't mind the denunciations, frankly. I mind the lies. Well, I mean, intellectuals are very good at lying. They're professionals at it. You know, wonderful technique. There's no way of responding to it. If somebody calls you, an anti-Semite, what can you say? I'm not an anti-Semite. Or, somebody says you're a racist, you're a Nazi or something. You always lose. I mean, the person who throws in the mud always wins because there's no way of responding to such charges.
These silencing labels can be anywhere from a communist or a Nazi or a white nationalist, a kook, fake news, a conspiracy theorist, or virtually any derogatory term. And when these labels are thrown around, they are often done very quickly or subtly. Here's a clip where CNN manages to label Julian Assange as a paid Russian agent and a pedophile in only a matter of seconds.
In his answer of saying, I got it from a DNC source, or I got it from somebody else, not the Russians.
A couple reasons. I think the primary reason is if the answer is he's aware of Russian involvement, why would he want to say that? That taints his whole operation. I think in general what he wants to do is to portray WikiLeaks as unbiased in terms of where it receives information and not a paid party receiving stuff from Russian security services. So I think there's an effort to protect WikiLeaks from a pedophile who lives in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. This guy is not credible.
The reason this tactic is so effective is because once a person decides internally for themselves that they hate someone, everything they do becomes offensive. So whenever you notice these labels being thrown out there that imply to not listen to another person, remember this quote. When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say. And now for tactic number 6, attacking strengths. What makes this tactic different from a traditional smear campaign is that its purpose is to confuse the audience. That instead of stating the truth about another person's weak spots, you instead spread complete lies about the other person's strengths. This tactic happens to be one of Karl Rove's playbook moves, as illustrated when George Bush slandered John Kerry in 2004.
Also, what is your opponent's biggest strength? You attack it. When John Kerry ran against George Bush, he was a war hero. He had Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. They attacked his Purple Hearts. They said they were all fake. He got them when he was running away. His guys who worked with him on the Swift boat hated him. That's where they attacked his strength.
And we also saw this tactic being used a lot in the 2016 election, such as when Hillary attacked Bernie's public record of his marching with Martin Luther King, and Bernie's getting arrested for protesting segregation. Hillary tried to get John Lewis to denounce Bernie and trying to say it didn't happen at all. And this gaslighting tactic was very successful for Hillary's campaign until the original photographer stepped forward and testified of Bernie's involvement and provided additional pictures of the events. And that finishes part 1 of the gaslighting lesson. We went over the shock reaction, the inflicting guilt, applying a negative connotation, false authority, poisoning the well, attacking strengths, and the second part of this lesson we will go over weaponized hypocrisy, aggressive denial, unestablished premise, derogatory terms, the changing or removal of information, and the bait and switch. That wraps it up. Stay tuned for the second half, and until next time.